On my birthday, instead of congratulations, my brother stood in the living room, pointed at one of my canvases, and said coldly, "Stop embarrassing us with your paintings. They're a joke." The words hit harder than if he had struck me. There was no laughter in his voice, no kindness hidden between the lines, only contempt. The room grew silent, but it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of agreement. Eyes turned toward me, some smirking, others looking away in discomfort, as if my very presence was something to be ashamed of. My painting, the one I had poured weeks of sleepless nights into, stood against the wall, still wet with color, and already it was condemned. From the beginning, my brush was never seen as a tool of creation, but as an object of ridicule. Every stroke I made was treated like a mistake, every shade of color dismissed as nonsense. When others held pencils or ledgers, their work was respected. When I held a brush, it was treated as childish, a waste of time. I learned quickly that in their eyes, art was not a calling, it was a flaw. I remember their laughter most of all, the kind of laughter that doesn't fade quickly, but lingers like smoke in a room long after the fire is gone. They laughed at my landscapes, said the skies looked too heavy, the trees too alive, the shadows too long. They mocked my portraits, called them distorted, grotesque, unfit to hang on any wall. Even when I tried to give a painting as a gift, something born from the deepest part of me, it was received not with gratitude, but with a mocking smile, tucked away in a closet as if hiding shame. But what they never understood was that each painting was more than colors thrown onto canvas. Every brushstroke carried my breath. Every shade carried a memory. Every line was the quiet language of my soul. To them, it was failure. To me, it was survival. And yet, the more they mocked, the more my silence grew. I did not shout back, did not argue, did not beg for understanding. I simply painted. At night, when their laughter echoed in my ears, I painted. When their whispers followed me down hallways, I painted. When their rejection weighed on me like stone, I painted. Still, their voices haunted me. "You'll never be an artist. No one will ever want these. Stop wasting your life." Words meant to bury me, to strip me of the very thing that gave me breath. And though I carried my brush like a shield, I could not stop the wound their cruelty left behind. From the very first moment I revealed my work, I learned that the world can be crueler than any empty canvas. And I also learned something else, that sometimes the greatest pain comes not from strangers, but from the people who share your name, your blood, your table. They thought their laughter would silence me. They thought their rejection would end me. But all it did was carve the truth deeper into me. The brush they mocked would one day speak louder than all their voices combined. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something like this in your own life, when others doubted or mocked your passion? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you're helping us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to light. Now, let's continue. It was one thing to hear strangers laugh at my work, to feel their mocking glances slide over my canvases as if they were stains on the walls of small community exhibitions. That pain cut deep, yes, but I could still tell myself that they did not know me, did not understand me, that strangers could never truly see what lived inside my brush. But when the same scorn began to rise from my own family, the wound grew darker, deeper, like a knife twisting where it hurt most. Even at home, I could find no refuge. I would bring in a painting, eager like a child, hoping that maybe this time they would look at it differently. Maybe this time they would see more than blotches of color. But instead of joy, my arrival was met with sighs, long, heavy sighs that seemed to weigh down the room. My father would rub his temples as though my work gave him a headache. My mother's smile would vanish, replaced with a look of quiet pity, as though she feared what others might think if they ever discovered that her son still chased dreams with paint-stained hands. And worst of all was the way they hid my work. Whenever guests came to visit, my paintings disappeared. Canvases that had cost me nights of labor, hours of standing in silence before the easel, were taken down, carried into back rooms, stacked carelessly against walls and closets, or shoved behind boxes in the garage. My creations were treated as secrets, embarrassing reminders of something shameful, like a family disgrace better left unseen. I remember one evening in particular. I had brought in a large canvas, a storm-touched seascape that I had poured every ounce of myself into. The waves roared across the canvas, the sky heavy with clouds that almost pressed down on the viewer, and in the distance a single light, a lighthouse standing defiant against the storm. To me it was not just a painting, it was my soul on display, my story told in oil and pigment. But when I placed it in the living room, hoping they might feel even a fraction of what I had felt while painting it, my sister whispered sharply, "Take it away before people come over. It looks depressing." My father said nothing. He only nodded toward the hallway, as though confirming that I should hide it, erase it, remove it before it stained the evening. And so the lighthouse, my symbol of defiance, was banished to the shadows, unseen and unwanted. The shame was not mine, though it clung to me like a shadow. The shame belonged to them. They were ashamed to let the world know that someone in their family had chosen art over practicality, brushstrokes over steady wages, vision over convention. And yet they dressed their shame as my failure, their embarrassment as my burden to carry. There is no loneliness greater than the kind you feel at your own table. To sit among those who share your blood, yet feel their eyes avoid yours, feel their hands move your work out of sight as though it were something contagious. It was betrayal, not in words, but in silence, in gestures, in the way they would smile politely at guests while my canvases sat hidden in the dark. But the brush is stubborn. Every time they tucked a painting away, I painted another. Every time their sighs filled the air, I answered them with color. And though they tried to erase me within my own home, I refused to vanish. My work remained, even if hidden. My truth remained, even if unspoken. For deep down, I believed something they could not, that a day would come when the same paintings they hid would be the very paintings they could no longer deny. There came a time when even the shadows of my family's rejection were not enough to keep me from stepping outside. I told myself that if they could not see, perhaps strangers would. Perhaps in the neutral air of a gallery, under the light of lamps meant for art and not for judgment, someone would pause. Someone would feel, someone would understand. So I carried my canvases out of the house, each one heavy not only with paint but with hope, and I placed them on the walls of small exhibitions where artists like me tried to be seen. But the rooms were not filled with understanding. They were filled with footsteps that clicked too quickly across the floor, with eyes that moved over my work as though it were wallpaper rather than the beating heart of a man displayed in color. People passed by, and when they did look, it was not with curiosity or awe. It was with the thin, sharp smile of dismissal, the kind of smile people give when they think something is beneath them, when they believe they have already measured you with a glance and found you lacking. I remember standing in a narrow gallery once, my hands clasped behind my back, watching as a couple paused before one of my pieces. For a fleeting moment my heart rose. They had stopped. They were looking, but then I heard their whispers. The woman tilted her head, smirking, and said, "It looks unfinished," like a child started it and walked away. The man chuckled in agreement, tugging her toward the next painting, as if leaving mine behind was a relief. They didn't know I was standing only a few feet away, or maybe they did, and they didn't care. The worst pain was not their mockery, it was their indifference. People who came to exhibitions wanted to be impressed, to be dazzled by names already spoken with reverence. They wanted art that had been validated by someone else's approval. And when they saw mine, unsigned by prestige, unblessed by fame, they saw only emptiness. They did not realize that every line had cost me sleep, every stroke had been wrestled from doubt, every canvas was a confession. To them it was nothing. To me, it was everything. Nights after those exhibitions, I would walk home carrying the same paintings I had brought in. The weight somehow doubled, though the canvases were no heavier. The streets seemed colder, the silence harsher, as if the city itself was reminding me that my work had not found a home, that the world had no place for it. I would pass by shops with windows full of meaningless decorations, things mass-produced and soulless, yet admired and bought. And I wondered why my work, alive with my pain, my memory, my breath, was deemed unworthy even of a glance. Each exhibition left me smaller in the eyes of others. Friends who once asked with curiosity how my art was going stopped asking altogether. My family began to speak of me in lowered voices, embarrassed that I still persisted, still believed. And the more they doubted, the more the world seemed to confirm their doubt. And yet, I could not stop. The emptiness of the galleries, the cruel whispers, the indifference that hung over me like smoke, all of it pressed me down, yes, but it also pushed me back toward the canvas. For in the solitude of my small room, with only the brush in my hand and the smell of turpentine in the air, I still found truth. When the world ignored me, the canvas never did. When the world looked past me, the colors stared back, alive, insistent, undeniable. The exhibitions were empty, yes. My name carried no weight, my work drew no applause. But deep inside I carried a certainty that one day, even if only once, someone would stop, not out of pity, not out of mockery, but because they finally saw what had always been there. And for that day, I painted on. It is one thing to be mocked openly, to see the curl of a lip or the roll of an eye when people look at your work. That pain, at least, comes face to face. It strikes, and you can meet it, endure it. But it is another thing entirely to hear your life dismissed in whispers, spoken in corners you were not meant to stand near, dripping with the ease of cruelty that thrives when the victim is not supposed to hear. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. I had left an exhibition hall carrying my canvases against the evening chill when I stopped by the side door to rest for a moment. My hands ached from gripping the frames, my shoulders heavy with more than just the weight of paint and wood. That's when I heard them. Two voices, men lingering just out of sight. Their tone was casual, relaxed, as if they were speaking of the weather, yet every word cut through me with surgical precision. "He's wasting his life," one of them said. "All those years, all that effort, and for what? No one cares about those paintings." The other laughed, not with joy, but with that hollow, mocking sound that strips the soul bare. "They'll never hang anywhere. He could paint until he dies, and no one would even notice. It's useless. He's useless." I stood, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. They didn't know I was there, only a few steps away, holding the very canvases they dismissed as trash. For a moment I wanted to step forward, to demand they look me in the eye as they spoke, but my feet would not move. Instead I felt the words pierce through me, sinking into places already tender with old wounds. Their laughter followed, thin and sharp, echoing in my ears long after their voices faded. Those whispers haunted me more than open ridicule ever did, because they carried not just cruelty, but certainty. They were spoken with such confidence, such conviction, as though my life had already been weighed, measured, and declared a failure. To them, I was not an artist struggling toward light. I was already a ghost, a man wasting his years in colors no one would ever see. And yet, As I walked home with those words gnawing at me, memories rose unbidden. Nights spent bent over a canvas, my hands blistered from labor during the day, but steady with a brush at night. The quiet triumph of capturing a moment of sky that felt alive, or a shadow that whispered of sorrow and hope at the same time. The way my own heart beat faster when the painting before me finally breathed, finally became something more than canvas and pigment. Those whispers denied all of it, erased it in an instant. To them, none of that mattered. To them, it was wasted time. Betrayal often wears a familiar face. These were not strangers to me. They were people who had smiled at me earlier, shaken my hand, offered polite words of encouragement. But in the hallway, when they thought I was gone, they spoke the truth of what they believed, and that truth cut deeper than any insult spoken directly. When I reached home that night, I set the canvases in the garage, leaned them against the wall, and stood staring at them in the dim light. For a long while I said nothing, did nothing. Their words echoed in the stillness. Useless, wasted, nothing. And I felt the coldness of it seep into me like frost. But as the minutes stretched on, something inside me pushed back. I reached for one of the brushes still stained from my last work. My hand trembled, not from weakness, but from defiance. If they thought my life was wasted, then let me waste it in color. If they thought no one would notice, then let me paint as though the canvas itself were enough. Their whispers had tried to end me. Instead, they became another layer of shadow beneath the light I still placed on canvas. And though they believed no one would ever see, I painted on, because even whispers cannot silence the truth waiting to be spoken in color. When the voices of mockery faded and the house fell silent, when even my own family's eyes had turned away from me, I always found myself returning to the same place. The canvas waiting in the corner, the smell of oil and turpentine, the quiet companionship of color. In the world outside, I was the failure, the foolish dreamer who wasted his life. But in those hours of night, when the city slept and no one's judgment could reach me, I lived more fully than I ever did in the daylight. The brush in my hand was never just wood and hair. It was a lifeline. Every stroke carried me away from their whispers, their sighs, their dismissals. Red reminded me that I was still alive, pulsing like blood in my veins. Blue carried me into silence, not the heavy silence of rejection, but the stillness of oceans and skies. Green let me breathe, reminded me of summers that had not been poisoned by shame. And black gave depth to everything else, the shadow that made the light visible, the grief that made hope burn brighter. I would stand for hours, my body weary, my hands trembling from work that gave me nothing in return, and yet I painted as if my life depended on it. Perhaps it did, for while others measured life in money, in approval, in recognition, I measured mine in color. A single night of painting could wash away an entire day of ridicule. A single finished line could silence 1,000 whispers. And yet it wasn't only healing, it was memory. Every painting I made was also a record of who I was in that moment. A sky painted with fiery streaks was the night I chose defiance over despair. A portrait shadowed with sorrow was the night I wept in silence, brush catching every tear the world would never see. A small still life, a bowl of fruit on a table, was the night I tried to remind myself of simplicity, of beauty hidden in the ordinary. My life was written not in journals or letters, but in paint, layer after layer, as though each canvas carried a chapter of my soul. I often thought that if anyone ever truly looked with eyes that sought more than surface, they would see me completely. They would know me without words. They would understand that the color I laid down was not random, not meaningless, but the truest confession I could give. But no one looked. No one wanted to. And so I painted for myself, not because I was enough of an audience, but because the colors demanded to exist, whether the world welcomed them or not. There were nights when exhaustion pulled at me, when my body begged me to rest. When the voices of doubt grew too loud, I would pause, brush hovering over the canvas, and wonder if perhaps they were right. Perhaps my life was wasted here in these rooms, filling canvases that no one would ever want. But then I would catch a glimpse of a stroke I had just placed, a line of light across darkness, a curve that seemed alive, and in that moment I would remember. This was not waste. This was survival. This was truth. The memory of color never left me. It carried me through humiliation, through rejection, through betrayal. Others could strip me of dignity, of belonging, of recognition, but they could not strip me of color. As long as I had a brush, I still had a voice. As long as I had paint, I still had breath. And so, when the world laughed, I painted. When they turned their backs, I painted. When they whispered that my life was empty, I filled another canvas until dawn. Because even if no one else ever saw, I knew. I knew that in those colors lived the only truth I could not let die. The rejections came like a slow, endless rain, never fierce enough to drown me at once, but steady, relentless, soaking into every corner of my life, until I carried their dampness in my very bones. At first, I kept the letters, carefully folded, neatly stacked in a drawer. Each one carried the same empty language. Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, we are unable to accept your work at this time. Some were signed by hand, others printed without thought, but all carried the same cold verdict: no. The pile grew with the years. At first a few sheets, then a stack, then a drawer that would no longer close, and still I painted. Still I sent my canvases to galleries, to competitions, to curators whose eyes never lingered. Each letter was a stone, and I carried them all, until my chest felt heavy, until my very breath seemed to weigh more than it should. It wasn't only the letters, it was the faces, the polite smiles that masked impatience, the eyes that looked past me at exhibitions, searching for the next name, the next real artist. The sympathetic nods, the kind that are meant to soften the blow, but instead cut deeper. That look of pity, how I came to despise it. For pity is not compassion. Pity is a judgment cloaked in kindness, a verdict that says, "You are not enough, but I'll pretend I care as I watch you fail." I thought I would grow numb to it with time, that the weight of rejection might somehow become familiar, manageable, like an old wound you learn to live with. But it never did. Each dismissal was fresh. Each laugh behind my back carried the sting of the first. I built calluses on my hands from painting, but none on my heart from being dismissed. The weight never lessened. It only pressed harder as the years stacked upon themselves. There were days when I wondered if I had become a fool dragging a burden no one had asked me to carry. My family's eyes followed me when I came home with new canvases, their silence heavier than their words had ever been. Sometimes they would exchange glances, quiet sighs that told me they thought I was wasting not only my life, but theirs, forcing them to bear the shame of my obsession. And each sigh added to the load, another invisible stone on my shoulders. And yet, every time I thought I could not bear it, I found myself at the easel again. The rejections screamed, "Stop!" but the colors whispered, "Continue." The weight crushed me, but the brush kept pulling me back. Perhaps that is what art truly is, not triumph, not recognition, but persistence. To stand beneath the mountain of no and still dare to carve out a single yes. But the truth was undeniable. I was tired. Tired of climbing with no summit in sight. Tired of carrying letters that told me I did not belong. Tired of fighting for a place in a world that seemed determined to keep me outside. Each rejection added years to my soul, even as my body still moved through the motions of life. And yet, Somewhere deep within, beneath the bruises and the scars, I held on to a fragile, flickering truth. Weight does not erase worth. A mountain of refusals does not mean the climb is meaningless. It only means the summit is higher than I imagined. So I bore the weight. I bore it with trembling hands, with a weary heart, with silence heavy enough to crush me. And still I painted. Because even under the mountain of rejection, I knew if I stopped, if I laid down the brush, then the world's verdict would finally be true. And I could not allow that. There are moments in life when hope, fragile though it is, dares to rise again. I remember telling myself that perhaps my mistake was in offering my art to strangers, to those who did not know me, who could not see the history, the sacrifices, the love hidden in every stroke. Maybe the world outside could not understand, but family, surely family must. So on a holiday, when the house was filled with laughter and the air smelled of celebration, I decided to give them a gift. Not money, not something bought in a store, but a piece of myself, painted in silence, poured out with every ounce of my being. The painting had taken months. I remember each night I spent shaping it, each layer of color laid carefully like the folds of memory itself. It was not just a picture. It was the sum of who I was, the colors of storms I had endured, the fragile light of mornings I had clung to, the echo of every rejection I had turned into resolve. In that canvas I placed not only paint, but years of silence, years of sacrifice, years of hope that one day my work would be seen, not as foolishness, but as love. When the time came, I wrapped it gently, covered it in brown paper, tied with string, and placed it before them with trembling hands. I remember the moment they opened it, the silence that fell across the room, the stares fixed on the canvas. My heart pounded, waiting for something, anything, a smile, a word of gratitude. Instead, there was only that silence again, the kind that does not honor, but condemns. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father gave a small cough as if searching for words he did not want to say. My sister forced a smile, quick and brittle, like glass about to break. They exchanged glances among themselves, quiet and sharp, as though my gift had put them in danger of embarrassment. And then, almost casually, almost without thought, someone suggested putting it away for now. Away. Those words struck harder than rejection letters, harder than laughter in galleries, because this was family. And family is supposed to hold what you give, even when the world does not. That same evening, I saw it. The painting I had labored over, carried in my heart as a piece of my very soul, was propped carelessly in the corner of the closet, half covered by an old coat, like something shameful they needed to hide before the next guest arrived. It was not honored, not even left in the open. It was buried. I cannot describe the sound my heart made in that moment. It was not a crack, not a shatter, but a low, deep breaking, the kind that does not heal quickly. My gift, meant to bring beauty, to bring connection, to remind them that my love lived in the work of my hands, had become their shame. The canvas that carried my soul was treated as nothing more than clutter, something to be stored out of sight, like a mistake they hoped to forget. That night I could not sleep. I sat alone, the echo of the celebration long gone, and stared at my paint-stained hands. I wondered what more I could give, what more they needed from me to believe I was not worthless. And yet I knew, no gift of mine, no painting, no brushstroke could ever be enough for those who had already decided to see me as less. Still, even in the midst of that hollow grief, I whispered to myself that the canvas was not broken, even if they treated it as such. It lived. It carried my truth, whether hidden in a closet or displayed in the light. And though they had shamed it, one day the shame would no longer be mine to carry. Because a gift made with love cannot stay buried forever. There came a day when my paintings were no longer welcome inside the house at all. It happened quietly, without shouting, without arguments. Just a few glances, a few sighs, a few sentences disguised as suggestions. Maybe these would be better stored somewhere else. They take up too much space. The house feels cluttered. Words that pretended to be practical, but in truth were nothing more than judgment wrapped in politeness. And so my canvases, my confessions, my living heart sealed in color, were carried away to the one place no one cared to look, the garage. The garage was cold, smelling of oil, rust, and forgotten things. Its walls were stained, its corners crowded with tools, boxes, broken furniture, all the relics of usefulness past. And there, in that exile, my paintings stood lined against the wall. Tall canvases leaned against one another like prisoners pressed into a cell, smaller ones stacked on top of dusty crates. The light that fell through the small window was thin, gray, indifferent. Dust gathered on surfaces that had once glistened with wet paint, cobwebs stitched across corners where bright colors hid. Each time I stepped into that space, it felt less like a garage and more like a grave. My works, once alive with energy and possibility, now waited in silence, like bodies no one came to mourn. The laughter of my family from the house above seemed to press down through the ceiling, muffled, reminding me that joy lived elsewhere, while here only rejection remained. And yet, as I walked among them, brushing away dust with my fingertips, I felt their silent company. Each canvas held a piece of me, and though the world had banished them to this exile, they whispered back to me still. A storm-touched sky, once mocked, still carried its thunder. A portrait once dismissed as grotesque still looked back at me with eyes full of sorrow and fire. They were forgotten by everyone else, but not by me. I could not forget, because they were pieces of my breath, my nights, my very skin embedded in pigment. The hardest part was not their neglect. It was knowing that others chose to see them as shame. My art had not only been rejected, it had been hidden, erased, as though the act of painting itself were something indecent. Each time I entered the garage, I remembered how my sister's words stung. "Don't let guests see them." My father's muttered tone. "They'll never understand. Better to keep them out of sight." It was not simply that they disliked my paintings. It was that they feared what others would think if those paintings were seen. I was not just the family's failure. I had become their secret. And so the garage became my gallery, not of celebration but of endurance, not of admiration but of quiet defiance. I spent hours there sometimes, pulling back the covers, standing in silence before them as if I were the last remaining visitor to an exhibition no one else ever attended. And in those hours, I realized something. Exile can break you, but it can also preserve you. My paintings were hidden, yes, but in their hiding they were safe from careless hands, safe from further mockery, safe from the constant sighs of disapproval. In their exile, they waited. Still, the weight of that banishment pressed on me. I would return to the house with the smell of dust on my clothes, my fingers stained with colors long dried, and I would hear them laughing, talking about business, about promotions, about things the world applauded. And I would know that somewhere between their lives and mine, a wall had been built, a wall made of misunderstanding, of scorn, of shame. But I carried a secret in my chest, one they could not erase, no matter how far they pushed my work into the shadows. The garage might have been exile, but it was not the end. For even in dust, even in silence, even buried behind old bicycles and boxes of forgotten tools, truth waits. Color waits. And I whispered to myself, every time I stepped into that cold space, one day, someone will open this door. And when they do, the world they've tried to bury will rise again. There are words that bruise, and then there are words that shatter. I had endured years of dismissal, years of quiet sighs and hidden canvases, Years of rejection letters that piled up like a mountain meant to bury me alive. But nothing compared to the night when betrayal wore the face of family and spoke aloud what others had only whispered. We were gathered in the living room, the lights warm, the table set with food, laughter buzzing like bees around honey. For a moment I almost believed that this night would be different, that here, among my own blood, I might be safe from mockery. But safety, I would learn again, was an illusion. It was my son-in-law who spoke with the kind of ease that cruelty often carries, casual and cutting at the same time. He leaned back in his chair, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, and said, "He'll never accomplish anything. Let him hang his scribbles in the shed, not in this house." The words hit me like a blade plunged into the chest. Scribbles. Shed. A lifetime of labor reduced to the word scribbles. 1,000 nights turned into a punchline. And the house I had once built with my hands, the home where I had sacrificed for years, now declared too sacred for my art, fit only for exile among cobwebs and rust. But what cut deeper than his insult was the silence that followed. I waited, hoped for someone to defend me, my daughter, my sister, my own flesh and blood, a word, a glance, even the smallest protest. But no one spoke. No one challenged him. No one said, "That's not true. His art is more than that. His life is worth more than your mockery." Instead, there was only the sound of forks scraping plates, the nervous shifting of bodies, the embarrassed coughs of those who would rather let cruelty reign than risk discomfort. And in that silence, I understood betrayal in its purest form. It was not the insult itself that destroyed me. It was the agreement hidden in their quiet. For silence is not neutral. Silence sides with the loudest voice in the room. And that night, silence crowned him king. I looked around the table, at faces I had known all my life. Faces that had once looked at me with pride, with love when I was younger and still believed I could be anything. Now those same faces avoided mine, eyes cast down as though ashamed not of his cruelty, but of my presence. And I realized I was no longer one of them. I had been pushed beyond the walls of my own family, exiled not only to a garage, but to the very edges of belonging. I thought of the canvases stacked in the dust, each one a testament to nights when I could have surrendered but chose to paint instead. I thought of the colors I had poured into them, the way they had carried me when no one else did. And now those canvases were mocked as scribbles. My defiance was called failure. My art was branded shame. That night, I did not argue. My silence was not consent, but exhaustion. What words could I offer that would not be drowned out by their indifference? What defense could I give when the very people I would have died for would not lift a finger to defend me? I let the silence swallow me whole, but inside, I felt something burn, a small flame of anger, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that waits. Because betrayal cuts deep, yes, but it also clears the air of illusion. It showed me the truth. They had never believed in me, not really. They wanted me quiet, invisible, tucked away like the canvases in the garage. And in their silence they revealed that they would rather protect their comfort than my dignity. I walked away from that table feeling smaller than I had ever felt. But within that smallness lived something dangerous. For even as betrayal pressed its weight upon me, another truth whispered back. They may bury your paintings in the garage. They may bury your name in silence. But they cannot bury what is alive in your hands. Keep painting. That night was betrayal, yes. But it was also the night I understood that justice does not come when family defends you, or when the world applauds. Justice comes when truth, no matter how long it hides, decides to step into the light. And though no one else knew it yet, I could feel it. Justice was waiting. After that night of betrayal, I should have stopped. By every measure of the world, by the weight of silence around me, by the mockery that had become a constant echo, I should have laid the brush down. But I couldn't. Something in me refused to die, so I turned again to the canvas, though this time not for recognition, not even for hope. I painted because the act itself was the only way I still knew how to breathe. There was one canvas left, large, raw, unframed. I dragged it into the garage where the others leaned in their dusty exile, and I set it against the wall. I did not plan a subject. I did not sketch outlines. I simply began, letting the brush move where my pain demanded, letting the colors clash, collide, bleed into one another. It was reckless, wild, almost violent, but it was honest. That painting became my diary. Not in words, not in sentences, but in layers of color too heavy for anyone else to carry. The anger of betrayal burned red into the background. The years of rejection sat in bruised blues, heavy and cold. Grief lingered in shadows of gray, while a single streak of white cut through it all, thin but unbroken, like the last fragile thread that kept me alive. Night after night I returned to it. Sometimes I painted furiously, covering whole sections in one sitting, the brush digging into the canvas as if I could carve the pain out of myself. Other nights I added only a single line, a single mark, enough to remind myself that I was still here, still capable of leaving a trace behind. It was not beautiful in the way people expected art to be. It was raw, jagged, unsettling. But when I looked at it, I saw myself more clearly than in any mirror. Every rejection, every silence, every whisper of failure, they all lived there, captured forever. The canvas became my confession, my testament, my last unfiltered truth. And so, while the world dismissed me, while my family hid my paintings in closets and laughed at the thought of me as an artist, one work remained. It stood in the garage, surrounded by dust and shadows, unseen, unwanted. But to me, it was everything. It was my final defiance, my last canvas, my legacy in waiting. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that carried no promise of change. The house was quiet, the garage heavy with the same stillness that had wrapped itself around my abandoned canvases for years. I had grown used to that silence, the way it settled into my bones, the way it convinced me that nothing new could ever come. So when the knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate, it startled me like a sound breaking through a dream. I opened it with no expectation, ready for a neighbor, a delivery, another intrusion of the mundane. Instead, there they stood, two figures, well-dressed, with folders tucked under their arms, and eyes that did not glance past me the way most eyes did. They introduced themselves softly but clearly, representatives from the museum. The words barely reached me, muffled as though the air had grown too thick to breathe. They said they had heard of my work, not from critics, not from family, but from someone who had stumbled upon it years ago and had not forgotten. They asked, almost reverently, about one of my old canvases. The description they gave was unmistakable. It was the one I had left in the garage, my last confession, my hidden diary in paint. At first, I laughed. Not from amusement, but from disbelief. My voice cracked under the weight of it. For so long, I had been told my paintings were nothing, that they were shame, clutter, scribbles unworthy of light. To hear the word museum in the same breath as my work felt like a cruel trick. I searched their faces for signs of mockery, for even the faintest glimmer of insincerity, but found none. Their eyes held something else entirely. Respect. I tried to form words to explain that they must be mistaken, that the canvas was nothing more than a forgotten piece rotting in dust and cobwebs, but they interrupted gently. We know what we are looking for. We would like to see it. My hands trembled as I led them to the garage. The old hinges groaned when I opened the door, revealing the exile where my canvases had been sentenced to stand for years. Dust motes floated in the slanted light, settling on the faces of forgotten portraits, on the storms sealed in oil, on landscapes no one had dared to love. And there it was, leaning where I had left it, colors muted by time, but alive still, waiting. They stopped as soon as their eyes fell upon it. The silence that followed was not the silence of dismissal I had come to know, but something weightier, fuller. One of them stepped closer, studying the strokes, the lines, the places where pain and defiance had hardened into pigment. He exhaled slowly, almost as if the painting itself had spoken to him. In that moment, disbelief gave way to something I had not felt in years: hope. Fragile, trembling, unfamiliar. The canvas I had abandoned, the canvas I had painted for no one but myself, had drawn them here. The work born from my deepest loneliness had crossed the distance I thought uncrossable. And as I stood there, watching strangers honor what my own family had buried in shame, I realized that the knock on the door was not just theirs, it was destiny's. They stepped into the garage as though entering a sacred place, though to me it had always been a tomb. Dust on the floor, cobwebs in the corners, canvases leaning like forgotten gravestones. I had walked through this space countless times, carrying the weight of failure with every step. But when the curator crossed the threshold, everything shifted. His eyes moved across the room, and when they landed on the canvas, he stopped. For a long moment no one spoke. The air seemed to thicken, time stretching in silence. I watched him, this man who had probably seen thousands of works in his life, who had studied masterpieces I could only dream of standing beside. And yet, before my painting, he stood still, his face altered by something I had never witnessed from anyone: reverence. I had seen smirks, forced smiles, polite nods, eyes glazed with indifference. I had endured every variation of dismissal. But I had never seen this, never seen someone look at my work as if it mattered. His gaze traced the brushstrokes, lingering over the chaos of colors, the jagged lines, the streak of white breaking through the darkness. Where others had seen mess, he saw meaning. Where others had seen failure, he saw fight. Slowly, he exhaled, and it sounded like a prayer. His lips parted slightly, as if words wanted to escape, but none were strong enough. He turned his head toward his colleague, who gave only a small nod, as though confirming what both of them already knew. This was not clutter. This was not shame. This was art. I stood frozen, my hands shaking at my sides. For years I had dreamed of this moment, imagined what it might feel like if someone, anyone, truly saw my work. Yet when it finally happened, I felt almost unworthy to witness it. My mind flashed back to every insult, every whisper of useless, every evening when I watched my paintings hidden away as if they were stains. And now, the same strokes that had earned me scorn were reflected in this man's eyes as something worthy of honor. The respect on his face was not loud, not theatrical. It was quiet but deep, the kind that sinks beneath the skin. And in that quiet I felt years of rejection tremble and fall away. My canvas, my last desperate confession, was speaking at last. Not with explanations, not with defenses, but with the truth that had always lived in its colors. For the first time in my life, I realized I did not need to explain myself. The painting was enough. My silence was enough. And his eyes, eyes that finally saw, were the only audience I had ever needed. The silence in the garage stretched, thick with something I could barely breathe through. The curator's hand hovered just above the canvas, not daring to touch, as if the weight of it demanded reverence. His eyes still held that quiet awe, and then, finally, his voice broke the stillness. "We want to buy it." The words struck me harder than every insult I had carried all those years. Buy it. Not hide it. Not laugh at it. not bury it under boxes in the garage. They wanted the very painting my family had mocked, the one shoved into exile, the one whispered about as useless, the one they said should never hang in the house. I could not speak at first. My throat closed, my chest tightened. For so long I had been told my work was worthless, that my colors were wrong, my brushstrokes foolish. And yet here they were, people who had no reason to flatter me, standing in the dust and shadows of my garage, offering not pity, but recognition. I looked at the canvas again, the wild strokes, the wounds turned into pigment, the streak of white cutting through darkness. It had been born in betrayal, grown in silence, abandoned like I had been. And now it was chosen. The irony carved itself into my heart. The painting they had tried to erase would become the one the world remembered. The curator repeated himself, his voice steady, certain. "We want it for the museum." The word museum echoed in my ears like thunder. For years I had heard my name in the same breath as failure, shame, disappointment. Now my name, tied to this canvas, was being spoken in the same breath as museum. I thought of my family, of the night my son-in-law called my work scribbles, of my sister hiding my gifts in closets, of my parents sighing whenever I brought another painting into the house. I thought of every exhibition where strangers walked past me as if I did not exist. I thought of the weight of rejection letters stacked like gravestones in my drawer, and suddenly all of it seemed to collapse beneath the power of this moment. They wanted the painting, not as charity, not as pity, but as art. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not wipe them away. I let them fall, because they were not the tears of defeat I had known for so long. They were tears of something I had almost forgotten I was capable of feeling. Vindication. In that garage, surrounded by dust, with cobwebs above and silence pressing in, justice arrived. Not in thunder, not in shouting, not in my family's apology. It arrived in 4 quiet words spoken with certainty. We want to buy it. And with those words, the painting they had buried became the painting that would outlive us all. When the curator spoke his offer, when the word museum echoed through the dust-filled garage, I did not answer. I didn't need to. My silence was enough, and in that silence something else happened. My family, who had followed us reluctantly into that place of exile, finally saw. I felt their eyes on me first, hesitant, unsettled. Then, slowly, their gaze shifted to the canvas, to the very painting they had mocked and banished. It stood exactly as it had for years, leaning against the wall, its edges frayed, its colors muted by dust. But now it was crowned with the only thing that could never be forced, recognition. And for the first time, they could not look away. My son-in-law's smirk was gone. The arrogance he wore like armor had cracked, leaving only the pale mask of disbelief. He had called it scribbles, fit only for a shed, and now he watched as men of culture and authority called it art, worthy not only of admiration but of preservation. His silence was heavier than any insult he had spoken. My sister stood with her arms crossed, but her posture betrayed her. She tried to appear unmoved, yet I saw her eyes flicker, saw the shame she could not hide. It was her hands that had carried my paintings into closets, her voice that whispered, "Better not let anyone see." And now those same hands trembled as she realized that hiding my work had never erased its worth. My parents, older now, leaned quietly near the doorway. My mother's lips pressed together, her eyes shimmering as though tears threatened but could not fall. My father's shoulders sagged, not with pride, but with the crushing weight of regret. For years they had sighed at my canvases. For years they had wished me into something else, someone else. And now, in one unspoken moment, they saw what I had always known, that their shame had never been mine to carry. I did not turn to them. I did not speak. I simply stood beside the canvas, the same way I had stood beside it on all those nights when no one else would. I did not need to say "I told you so." I did not need to defend myself, or to reopen old wounds with words. The truth was before them, painted in color, undeniable, and in their faces I read everything. The confusion of realizing they had been wrong. The shame of knowing their silence had cut deeper than any mockery. The dawning understanding that the man they had dismissed as a failure had created something that outlived their scorn. Justice came without my voice. It came without anger or vengeance. It came in the simplest of ways. Their eyes meeting mine, unable to look away, forced at last to acknowledge what they had tried so hard to bury. And in that quiet, in that heavy, undeniable silence, I felt something break, not in me, but in them. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not come with thunder or shouting. It did not come with family arguments or apologies shouted across the table. It came quietly, reverently, in the echoing halls of a museum where silence is sacred and every wall carries the weight of history. I stood there the day they unveiled it. My painting, the one that had lived years in dust and exile, the one my family had hidden in closets and mocked as scribbles, now stood framed, lit from above, hung on a wall where thousands of eyes would pass. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paint, but to me it smelled of redemption. The gold plaque beneath bore my name, carved clean and sharp, a name no one could erase, no matter how many years of scorn they had piled upon me. I looked at it the way one might look at a child who had been lost and then returned home. There it was, alive in a way it had never been in my garage, its colors breathing under the museum lights. The brushstrokes, once dismissed as chaos, now carried the dignity of survival. The streak of white, thin but unbroken, no longer whispered quietly. It blazed, telling every passerby that light had cut through shadow, that defiance had endured betrayal. Visitors stopped before it. Some leaned closer, studying the texture. Others stepped back, as if distance might help them see the whole truth. And what struck me most was their silence. Not the silence of dismissal I had come to know, but the silence of reverence, the silence that comes when words fail in the presence of something greater than expected. I watched their faces as they stood there, eyes caught, breath slowed, hearts stirred by something they could not quite explain. They did not know the years behind it, the pain that had shaped it, and yet somehow in their stillness I could see that they felt it. The painting spoke for itself, carrying all that I had poured into it long before they arrived. My family stood with me that day. They had come because they could not stay away, because the shame that once made them hide my work now forced them to witness what could no longer be denied. Their eyes flickered from the painting to the plaque, to me, and back again. They said little, but they didn't need to. Their silence told me everything. They could never again call my work useless. They could never again bury my gift in closets or garages. The painting they had once despised was now untouchable, claimed by walls that honored it far beyond their reach. I did not gloat. I did not turn to them and demand apologies. The victory was not in their shame. It was in the permanence of truth. Because once a work of art hangs on a museum wall, it cannot be hidden again. Once it is seen by thousands, it can never be erased. My legacy was no longer in their hands. It had escaped them, broken free of their judgment, and now it belonged to the world. And in that moment, I felt a peace I had never known. Not because the pain was gone, the scars of rejection still lived in me, but because it had all been transformed. Every insult, every sigh, every betrayal had been transfigured into the very thing that gave this painting its life. Without the wounds, there would have been no brushstrokes. Without the exile, there would have been no defiance. Without the silence, there would have been no voice as powerful as this one. I stepped closer to the canvas, my reflection faint in its protective glass. For a heartbeat, I saw myself as I once was, alone in a dim garage, dust in my lungs, despair in my chest, painting into the void because it was all I knew. And then I saw myself as I was now, standing in a hall where strangers stopped to honor what I had created, where my name would outlive me, where no one could laugh it away. Justice had come, not with noise, but with light, not with revenge, but with permanence. It had come in the form of a painting that would remain long after I was gone, telling my story in color to people who would never know my face, but would feel my soul. And from that day forward, no one, not family, not critics, not strangers, ever dared to call my work empty again. Because a brush, once mocked, had spoken louder than all their voices, and its legacy would never be silenced.